It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Housing isn't just in short supply in New York City. It's the stuff of lawsuits and political battles. Landlords have the Mamdani administration in court now, challenging the rent-stabilized rent freeze. Maybe you've heard that. Owners of million-dollar-plus second homes have the administration in court, challenging the pied-à-terre tax. You've probably heard that. One high-profile lawsuit just got settled. As our housing reporter David Brand first reported on Gothamist, the long battle over Elizabeth Street Garden is over. A team of developers picked to build low-income senior housing atop the lushly green, statue-strewn lot in Lower Manhattan, David reported, has officially dropped a lawsuit it filed against the city for abruptly canceling the decade-old plan. The move on Thursday ends a long, bitter dispute that pitted pro-development advocates who highlighted the dire consequences of the affordable housing shortage against supporters of the Elizabeth Street Garden who sought to preserve the unique green space. That from David Brand's reporting. He's about to join us. One thing I want to know, does this agreement have implications for other housing construction plans where neighbors don't want new buildings for whatever reasons, right? Gardens or no. David Brand joins us now to talk about the Elizabeth Street Garden settlement and the latest developments in the non-settlement so far in the rent freeze and pied-à-terre cases. Hey, David, always good to have you on the show. There may be a housing shortage, but there's never a shortage of housing stories and conflicts, is there?
Well said, Brian. That's exactly right. Housing shortage, no shortage of housing news.
Would you remind people where the Elizabeth Street Garden is? Probably most people listening right now have never been there or seen it or maybe even seen a picture. What does it look like there and where is it exactly?
Well, this is a city-owned lot on Elizabeth Street in Spring Street in Nolita. It is, like you described it in the intro, has a number of statues, plants, places to sit, tables, chairs. People go to relax during the day. You go in there, you see a lot of people drinking coffee. They have some events like movies, and I just saw on Instagram they had a Tai Chi session. So popular spot for people in that section of Manhattan.
Is it a community garden? When we hear garden, is it a community garden like people in the area can grow plots of vegetables or flowers there, or more just the kinds of things you were describing?
Yeah, more the kinds of things I was describing. So I think the characterization of it as a garden is, some people find that controversial because they say the people who supported the housing plan on that site say, wait a second, this is not a community garden. This is a city-owned lot. People have used it as a green space, have turned it into a kind of a really unique space, but this isn't a community garden like where people in the neighborhood are growing their own plants and growing their own vegetables and stuff. So some people bristle at that characterization, but it's here to stay, and it is known as the Elizabeth Street Garden.
And again, by way of background, when did the housing proposal first surface? And why there in the first place, if it was a garden or green space, which, at least when we hear that word, we think that's a rare and precious enough thing in a place like Lower Manhattan, at least in theory.
That's right. And I think for anyone, like mentioned, what does it look like for people who have never been there? Maybe people have been there or, have heard this kind of tangentially or in the background for a while. Like, why is this one specific lot in all of New York City getting such outsized attention? And why do so many people care about this? And I think it's because it has become emblematic of larger disputes over city housing and development policy. And so that those disputes and this kind has traced this kind of burgeoning, yes, in my backyard, YIMBY, pro-housing, pro-development movement that has really sprung up at the same time as there have been these fights over what will become of this specific site. So the housing plan first began back in 2012. Then council member Margaret Chin, who represented that section of Manhattan, proposed that lot as a future site of affordable housing. She proposed that to the Bloomberg administration. The de Blasio administration picked that idea up, began planning that as a potential site for new housing, and in 2017 awarded a potential contract to develop the housing there to 3 organizations and companies. So that's Habitat for Humanity, another nonprofit called Riseborough, and the for-profit developer Penrose. That was 2017. The plan then went through the city's land use review process, the lengthy process. It involves community board input, city planning commission vote, and then finally culminates in a city council vote and approval by the mayor. So it completed that process. City council and then Mayor de Blasio approved the development there. A nonprofit group that had started as part of the effort to preserve this lot as the Elizabeth Street Garden then sued. That case wound its way through various appellate courts until 2024, when the State Court of Appeals, state's highest court, sided with the city and said development could proceed. Early in 2025, last year, the city actually issued an eviction notice to the garden, but then Mayor Eric Adams, the third mayor to preside over this plan, abruptly halted the plan for the housing and instead said, we're going to build the housing elsewhere, preserve this garden, and then shortly before leaving office, he deemed this parkland, which, according to now the fourth mayor, Mayor Zohran Mamdani, will preserve this permanently, and the city's hands are tied, and so they couldn't proceed with the housing plan there, and so they looked to settle with the developers involved. So a long history that has spanned 4 mayoral administrations while also tracing this larger kind of citywide effort to build housing versus preserve the parkland.
Right, and I think you've heard me state my Bryan's law of housing politics in New York City. Everybody says we desperately need more affordable housing, and everybody says, just don't build any near me. So this is the Elizabeth Street Garden version of that. Listeners are calling in already. We know, obviously, people in the area have strong feelings about this. So listeners, we can take some of your reactions to this settlement news. 212-433-WNYC. The Elizabeth Garden gets to stay, which means there will be no affordable senior housing on that site. Did you or someone in your family apply for one of those senior housing units that was originally promised there? If you live near the garden, how does this resolution sit with you? 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. You can also call with questions about some of the other housing news that we will get into, the legal challenge to the rent freeze, or the pied-à-terre tax, or David's most recent story, headline, New York City still refused most emergency aid requests to prevent eviction after Mamdani took office. The pace of those refusals did not change from the Adams administration in the early months of Mamdani. So on that as well, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. So on Elizabeth Street, David, bring us to the present. What exactly happened last week?
All right, so last week, as you mentioned, those developers, the development team officially dropped its lawsuit against the city. And part of this new agreement is that they will instead get the rights to develop another city-owned lot, this time at 22 Suffolk Street on the Lower East Side. This is a narrow lot. It's next to another mega development from about a decade ago called Essex Crossing. It had stayed vacant. The city was considering it as a potential site of a school. They determined that it wouldn't work for a school, and so now they're going to proceed with the housing with that same development team. But that's still several years away. City Hall spokesperson told me that they won't begin the land use review process, which takes 6 to 9 months for that site, until mid-2027. The development team still needs to put together financing, which could take until late 2028, and then we'll see from there. Development couldn't get started, I guess, until 2028 or later.
Yeah, and on the promise of a substitute site, I mean, that's kind of sketchy, right? as a legitimate conclusion to this, which is not to say the Elizabeth Street garden should or shouldn't remain a garden, but this connects to an older argument that Councilmember Chin and others have made for years, that other sites floated for affordable housing shouldn't be treated as swaps for Elizabeth Street. They should be additional, right? Because the city is looking for lots all over the place. There aren't enough lots for the city to build on, I think a lot of housing advocates would argue. So you can't really swap not building on one for building on another, when the advocates would say, no, we need to build on both.
Right. And, if only it were that easy to just transfer all the plans and all the financing from one lot to another. Like, this is a totally different process. So the same development team is getting this lot to build on, theoretically, but it's not like they can just transfer everything that was in place at the other spot for this one. And,
and it's still a net removal of one site for affordable housing construction. I mean, that's the point, right?
Right. Supporters of the housing plan say do both. The city is in an extreme affordable housing shortage. It's especially affecting seniors, so build the housing at both sites. But, you mentioned also, is this a swap? Well, we don't know if anything is guaranteed at all, because we saw 13 or 14 years ago the planning began and was moving apace at the Elizabeth Street Garden site, and it didn't happen. And so who knows when development would actually begin at this other lot.
Here is Lisa, who says she's 3 blocks from the Elizabeth Street Gardens, calling in with what we might call a little bit of alternative history, or to fill in certain gaps in the history as we were telling it. Lisa, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I had the distinction of being on the city council staff at the point where Margaret Chin advocated for and got an agreement from the city to develop on what people are now calling the Elizabeth Street Garden. But at the time, and I think this was before 2012, maybe 2011, it was a lot that had been usurped by the businessman who had a business next door where he sold remnants of city-owned buildings, things like gargoyles or distinctive features of vacant buildings, which he stole out of those vacant buildings and put in his store, and also displayed them in the vacant city-owned lot next door. It had a fence around it. It was not accessible. It certainly was not a place where people could go and relax and view movies and musical presentations. It's just outrageous to me. I also was involved in 1970s when the site where 22 Suffolk Street is now was an urban renewal site that was slated for affordable housing all the way back to the 1960s.
That's the new site. That's the new site that's supposedly the swap site for the gardens, right?
Exactly. It's been designated for affordable housing. It is true that the community board also advocated for it to be a school, but its history as affordable housing goes back decades. And to say now we're only getting one of those 2 sites, as you very well pointed out, Brian, is just outrageous to me. And the last thing I want to mention is that Community Board 3 has never been consulted on the use of this Suffolk Street site. The site on Elizabeth Street is in Community Board 2. And as a former chair of Community Board 3, I find that insulting and outrageous. So you can tell from my voice how angry it makes me that this has become a citywide issue of such import. And I agree 100%.
Let me ask you, Lisa, given your history as a staffer for a city council member, as the site transitioned from being owned by a businessman next door who was using it
never owned, usurped. It was I don't know what its history was.
Okay.
I think it might have been part of an urban renewal effort, because there's going back, it was called the Little Italy Urban Renewal Area, going back to the 60s also. But it was city-owned.
Fair enough, I stand corrected. But as it transitioned to a garden, a community space that people started using in the way that they currently use it, did it give you or whichever city council member you were working for pause when thinking, gee, we need a lot of housing, but there isn't that much community open space in that area, and look how this has developed. Maybe we should rethink this. Did that ever occur to you or the council member you were working for?
There's always a concern about that for any responsible elected official, I would argue. But there is open space in that neighborhood. There's something called the Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park. It's about two blocks away, much closer, by the way, than Suffolk Street, which is like 12 blocks away. And that is an underutilized, under-maintained, and really available place for people to use if there was a commitment to make it more attractive.
Lisa, thank you very much for your call and your point of view and your experience with respect to this issue. Going to take one more, David, before we go back to you, from somebody who's also an opponent of the garden, a supporter of the housing, and wants to put yet another wrinkle on it. Larry in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Larry.
Hey, hi. Hey, Lisa just covered a lot of the ground I told your screener about. But yeah, this is public property that was appropriated by a group of people for their own use, and at the expense of low-income seniors who are a group in serious trouble in this city, as I'm sure you know, Mr. Larry. You covered a lot of the issues. You and Lisa pretty much covered everything I want to say. But this seems elitist, that a group of people are using it for their own artistic, wonderful purposes. That's all great. That's all wonderful, at the expense of people who really need help. And as Lisa pointed out, there is public space within blocks of that area. I don't live there anymore, but I did years ago. I know that area. I know Sarah Roosevelt Park very well. And there is this space. And it seems that this is just, as Lisa said, the appropriation of public property by a private small group of people. And I'm disappointed in Mayor Mamdani's administration for allowing this to happen.
Larry, thank you very much. And we'll get to why Mamdani says his hands were tied here. And David, what his actual positions have been on the Elizabeth Street Garden and housing for that site. But I thought Larry in Brooklyn there was going to name names when he said this was for the elites, because there was a celebrity factor here, right? Robert De Niro, Scorsese, Patti Smith, all weighed in to save this garden. How much of a role did that play in the outcome, as far as you can tell?
Well, they did write letters to the then Mayor Adams administration backing the garden and begging them to leave the site alone. I don't know how much influence that had, but it did kind of correspond with the Adams administration having its change of heart. That was really driven by the then new deputy mayor, Randy Mastro, who orchestrated this plan to kill the housing plan and to preserve the garden not long after that in 2025. I think those are great calls from Lisa and Larry, and that was a ton of institutional memory from Lisa that I thought was really important to add to this conversation. But it reminded me of something you said in the intro, Brian, when you talked about like what type of precedent does this set. And that's what I think has been most interesting to me about this saga. And I had been covering it and obviously paying attention to this for several years. And then I really got even more interested when Adams did reverse himself last June and killed the housing plan, because it had come after about 12 or 13 years of a succession of mayoral administrations backing this in the face of community opposition there, in the face of several lawsuits and a 5-year legal challenge that the city won, issuing the eviction notice, Mayor Adams himself going to a community town hall and getting flack from people saying, why won't you save the Elizabeth Street Garden? And saying, look, we need to build housing. We desperately need senior affordable housing, only to then reverse himself. And so that's what has been my biggest interest. And what opponents of that decision say is, well, what kind of precedent does this set for other projects in the future that communities disagree with? And if a community is well-connected or has influence or has money, do they have a leg up? Supporters of the garden will say, look, this isn't just wealthy or celebrities who are backing this. We have thousands of signatures from community members. We have working class people coming to this site too. So they don't want to be painted with that brush. But it does raise that question about the precedent.
We took 2 callers who don't like the outcome here, who thinks senior affordable housing should have been the priority for that site. In the interest of dialogue, not diatribe, as we do on this show, Robin in Soho is going to articulate the other point of view. Hi, Robin.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having this discussion. I live in the neighborhood. I am a senior citizen. There is so little green space for us downtown. We literally have to go to Washington Square Park, where it is packed with people. As a senior, it's getting harder and harder for me to go across Houston Street and walk that distance. Elizabeth Street Garden is near where I live. It is a community center. They have events for people to do Tai Chi and poetry and music. It has pulled us all together, not to mention the millions of people that come every year to go to that beautiful, beautiful garden. We don't have Central Park. We don't have Riverside Park. We don't have what the East Village has with a lot of neighborhood gardens. We are concrete. We have almost no trees in Soho and Nolita. This is all we have. And to lose that garden,
let me just ask you right on that specific point. The previous 2 callers cited Sarah Roosevelt Park as meaningful green space right in the neighborhood.
It's all concrete and basketball courts. It's dangerous. It is not a garden. It is not a real park. Obviously, I'm in favor of housing for seniors. That particular site was going to be used for developers to put in commercial spaces and maybe small apartments for a few seniors. This city has lots of spaces where you can put in housing. They should be doing that and not working with developers who are making millions of dollars and taking away nature from people who, I don't have a house in the Hamptons. I don't get to go to the beach every weekend. I live here year-round, and I would have been so depressed to lose that garden and that sense of community that we just simply don't have.
Robin, thank you for your call. I appreciate it. And there, David, I think for people who've been listening for 10 minutes or so, that really exemplifies, the callers on either side of this, how strongly and earnestly and heartfelt both positions have been.
Yeah, people are very passionate about this on both sides, and that's why it has kind of driven this bigger community or bigger citywide conversation and has gotten so much attention because we heard from Robin. She seems to love that spot, and it is a very unique place, and it is very cool, and it has a lot of people have come to really love it, and that really heightened the stakes and the tensions.
So when Mayor Mamdani says his hands were tied, what's his history on this? Did he campaign one way or another when he was running for mayor? And why, rather than celebrating this settlement, did he kind of come out with a statement that said, well, my hands were tied, I didn't really have a choice?
So listeners might recall that in the mayoral campaign last year, this did become an issue, and all of the candidates were asked whether they supported keeping the garden there or building the new housing. That was part of a New York Times interview series. And Mamdani said he supported the housing plan. He then later told the news site Hellgate during an appearance, an interview with them, that he would evict the garden if he were elected. But now says his hands are tied because shortly before leaving office, Mayor Eric Adams designated it as parkland. And so and turn it over to the Parks Department. And so if that was a legally binding decision, then the only way to reverse a parkland designation would be to have state lawmakers do parkland alienation. And so to turn it from a park back to some other use. Mamdani could have challenged the legal basis for that and saying, well, this was determined to be a site for new housing development after a public review process. And so you would need to do another public review process to determine that it's parkland. That's an argument from pro-housing supporters who say this wasn't actually legal, what Adams did. But, if you take it that it actually is and that it was determined to be parkland, it would take a lot of, I think, political capital to get the state legislature to then reverse that decision for this one site. And so he's saying his hands are tied by the decision to determine it was parkland.
And I think Bill in Jackson Heights is calling in specifically on the mayor's role, and critically it looks like. Bill, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, long time, first time. And I will say David Brand has kind of preempted a lot of my points. The basic idea of the lawsuit was that you can't change the permitted land use of something simply through an agency redesignation. You can't change it from residential to park. It has to go through ULURP. That was the point of the lawsuit. So as Mr. Brand said, if the transfer was illicit, you don't have to go to the state to begin with. So he could have conceded the lawsuit. My hypothesis is that it's not in the nature of executives to concede lawsuits, and if he allows that precedent, then he takes something out of his toolbox forever that he may not want to take. Again, this is just guesswork. I'm not inside his head. But as I said, he sidesteps state alienation if you concede the illegality to begin with, but perhaps he just didn't want to do that. But as I said, I have a problem with the whole idea you can just change the land use of something without going through the ULURP process, which is designed to do that. So that was my bit, and Mr. Brown covered a lot of it very well.
Called ULURP. Bill, thank you very much. Call us again. And David, maybe you did kind of preempt his comment when you were talking about how the state legislature would need to approve, designation of parkland in the way you described it. But anything to add as context to Bill's call?
No, I think that was great what Bill said, and did seem kind of similar to what we were just talking about the that precedent. Can a mayor just kind of unilaterally deem something parkland without the public review, and would it be up to the state legislature to take it out of the parkland designation? And we did see the state legislature do that recently near Citi Field to pave the way for Steve Cohen's casino plan.
We're going to continue in a minute with WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand, but turn to some of the other stories he's been covering, including some of the other housing-related legal battles. There's a challenge in court now to the rent freeze on rent-stabilized apartments. There's a challenge in court now on the pied-à-terre tax, and also much less noted by the general public and the general press, but I'm really glad David reported it for us here on public radio. New York City still refused most emergency aid requests to prevent eviction after Mamdani took office. That's the headline on that one. We'll get to those stories with David, and maybe your calls on those and your texts. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes with WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand. The rent freeze lawsuit. What's the legal argument from the landlords?
So the landlords who are suing to try to overturn the Rent Guidelines Board decision that would freeze rents for the next or on 2-year leases when people sign their new leases after October 1st, they are saying that the Rent Guidelines Board ignored data showing landlords' expenses were rising in order to kind of fulfill Mayor Mamdani's campaign pledge to freeze the rent, and they want a judge to order the Rent Guidelines Board to go back to the drawing board and to hold a new vote.
One former board member, as you report, Christina Smith, resigned right before the vote. She accused the board of, in her words, starting with an answer and working backwards to justify it. But I see that the one member of the board who voted against the rent freeze says, no, the process was independent. This is just how it came out. That might be a strong argument against the landlords in court to have that kind of witness testimony, but I don't know.
Yeah, that was an interesting point. So, yeah, you mentioned the landlord rep on the board, one of two landlord reps on the board, Christina Smith. She's a landlord's attorney. She quit the day of the vote, saying that, the outcome's predetermined, that the board's just going to vote to fulfill Mamdani's goal. And then part of this lawsuit, which cites her letter to the board quitting her post, says that the Mamdani administration meddled, and they are seeking all of these documents and communications between City Hall, the top city officials, and the Rent Guidelines Board that could prove that there was some type of interference with the board, which is supposed to be an independent body. But a day after the vote, at a separate panel discussion, the one member who voted against the rent freeze is an economist named Arpit Gupta. He said that unlike in past administrations, there was no interference, and that he credited City Hall and city officials for not getting involved in the decision.
If the landlord group wins the lawsuit, what would that mean for rent-stabilized tenants who now have an expectation that they can sign 1 or 2 year lease renewals that take effect in October under the freeze as it passed?
Well, I think it would mean a lot of confusion, and it would be totally unprecedented. So, yes, people are planning their next lease decisions, sign a 2 year with no increase to their current rents, and maybe setting their budgets based on that. If the judge were to order the board to hold a new vote, that would be totally unprecedented, and we don't really know what that would look like. They could then hold a vote and come to the same conclusion maybe many months from now. Or
presumably they would come to the same conclusion. I mean, the mayor does basically control the Rent Guidelines Board, right? This was true under previous mayors. This is true under Mamdani. The mayor gets to appoint most of the members of that board. Correct me if I'm wrong. So why would the landlords come out with any different result, even if they win their lawsuit?
Yeah, it stands to reason that the same members of the same board, mostly selected by Mayor Mamdani, who defended their rent freeze decision on the dais, the day of the vote, would just vote the same exact way. So I think that could be just replicating what has already happened. I don't know if it's going to get to that point. There's an uphill argument here for the landlords to make in this lawsuit, but they're definitely trying.
What about the pied-à-terre tax? That's in court too. What's the owner's argument in that suit?
Yes, the pied-à-terre tax is in court and actually the subject of a city council hearing going on today because a group of homeowners, so to talk about the lawsuit, a group of homeowners, two of them actually relatives of Staten Island Councilman Frank Morano, sued the city saying that the rollout led to mass confusion because the city published this list of nearly 1 million properties and owners and property values where they said these properties could be theoretically subject to the tax, and that caused confusion for a lot of homeowners. In reality, the city ended up sending out notices to about 17,000 property owners, notifying them that they might be subject to this tax and giving them instructions on how to apply for an exemption. So far, according to court documents, about 2,000 property owners have had exemptions approved. So now we're down to about, 15,000 properties that could be subject to this tax. The initial estimate from Governor Hochul and state lawmakers is that it would apply to 13,000 luxury empty second homes, and specifically luxury second homes worth $5 million in the case of standalone, single-family, two-family homes, or $1 million in the case of co-ops and condos.
That's an important distinction that maybe doesn't get enough press. The pied-à-terre second homes, those that are actually second home pied-à-terres that are not people's primary residence, but just pied-à-terres they maintain in the city. Most of the initial news coverage said this would apply to those homes worth $5 million or more. But if it's a co-op or a condo, it's only $1 million or more. Do you know what percentage of the pied-à-terres those are? Because what kind of apartments are there in the city besides co-ops and condos that people own for the most part?
Yeah, I don't have an exact percentage, but most of these properties are going to be condos and co-ops that are sitting empty.
Now, one argument, or one, I guess, what's the right word? Positive side effect, maybe, of the pied-à-terre tax and the spotlight that the state is putting on who owns what where in the city and what things are second homes, is that it turns out to also be a vehicle for the state to catch tax evaders, people who actually do live in the city, because they're now going to claim exemptions, right? No, this isn't a pied-à-terre. This is where I really live. But aha, you pay income taxes in another state.
Yeah, exactly. It'll catch those tax cheats who, for income tax purposes, maybe say they live in a lower tax state like Florida or North Carolina, but then turn around when they are told they're going to be having to pay more on their second home in New York, say, no, actually, I live in New York. This is my primary residence. And then they're kind of in a bind. The Department of Finance could say, well, oh, you live in New York City? Why are you paying taxes in some other state?
What's the landlord, well, the owners, I should say, the pied-à-terre owners' argument in court here that, well, what would it result in, I should say, if they win the case?
Well, right now, their argument isn't challenging the tax per se. It's challenging the way the city went about implementing it in kind of a somewhat chaotic way, where they published this list of all these properties, got people worried, like, why is my address on this new list that just got published? Am I going to be subject to this tax? And because of that, they want to slow the implementation, have the city tailor the number of properties that actually are subject to it, and then to remove that list of addresses and property owners' names. I will say, though, that state law does require the city to publish their tax roll annually, and all of this information is already public. I think the difference here, though, is that it never gets this much attention. Mayor Mamdani was tweeting about, I think he said something like, property owners, check your mail because you're going to get this notice if you own a luxury second home, and the city put out a press release. And so that shed a lot more light and more attention on this list, and so people felt, sort of that it was an invasion, and also were wondering, wait, am I going to get this notice too? I live here.
I heard you mention the city council hearing on the pied-à-terre tax taking place today. Maybe we'll get to ask City Council Speaker Julie Menon about that when she comes on to launch the Speak with the Speaker series tomorrow morning. But I see you just dropped a new article on Gothamist about that hearing, with the clever, though people will have to translate from the French, headline of Pied absent-terror. Pied absent-terror. Council members plan to read questions aloud despite Mamdani administration no-show. So you mean City Council is holding a hearing on the pied-à-terre tax? They wanted the Mamdani administration to send somebody to testify, and they refused?
Yeah, and so the Mamdani administration is not sending any representatives to testify. They are citing that ongoing litigation. I talked with Gail Brewer, a longtime politician here in New York City, and
Council member.
Council member, and is now representing the Upper West Side. And she says that she plans to read 11 pages of questions into the record and will then send it to City Hall and the Department of Finance to get answers to these various questions. But yeah, it should be kind of a weird hearing, questioning.
Why won't
empty
they send
chairs.
someone to answer the questions at a public hearing?
Well, that they are citing the litigation. Councilmember Brewer says, well, you can answer the questions that aren't directly related to the litigation, but that's the Mamdani administration's position, that they're not going to show up. We've seen this a few times in the past, and it seems to usually involve the NYPD In 2023, NYPD under Eric Adams didn't testify at a hearing over the controversial strategic response group. And then in 2020, under de Blasio, NYPD didn't show up to testify about their response to the George Floyd protests, pretty violent response from the NYPD there. But this is the first time we're seeing it under the Mamdani administration.
And one more topic before you go. You've also been reporting on the one-shot deal. That's the emergency rent assistance program that tenants could turn to when they're about to be evicted. Your reporting found the city is still rejecting something like 3/4 of those applications, even after Mamdani took office. Given this and everything we've been talking about, what are we seeing about this administration's ability to actually deliver on housing, in this case, relief from eviction, and why, given Mamdani's politics versus Eric Adams' politics, would the rate of approving those applications not have changed?
Well, that's a great question. And so for listeners, the One Shot Deal program is an emergency cash grant for people who can apply for this for a range of reasons. They owe utilities, they owe moving expenses, or the most common one is that they owe back rent. And so if they're in housing court facing eviction, the first thing they'll often do is apply for a one-shot deal to cover their arrears and stay housed. The city does end up approving these often. Thousands of people get these one-shot deals and avoid eviction, but the city is also rejecting 75% of applications that they receive. That's basically flat under Mamdani compared to what it was under Mayor Adams. And the rejection rate has actually increased pretty significantly in recent years. In 2022, they rejected about 62% of people. Prior to that, they were rejecting about 30% of people. But now they are at the 75% rejection rate. And so I don't think this is something that the Mamdani administration has really spoken about publicly or really focused on yet. But it could be a big problem if people facing eviction are having to jump through a lot of hurdles to get this emergency aid to stay housed.
Well, what's the standard supposed to be for having emergency eviction relief approved?
Well, there's a couple things you need to do. You need to submit your application with a lot of identifying and income documentation. You need to conduct an interview with someone from the city social services agency, and then there's a 30-day period where the case stays open, and after 30 days, the city can just automatically close the case if something's incomplete or if an interview hasn't been completed, or, sometimes there are errors that lead to these improper denials. To get this money, you have to prove your future ability to pay rent so that the city isn't covering your arrears, and then a year later you're back in the same position with even more money owed. You also need to show that your apartment is affordable, meaning that typically that would mean some type of affordable housing or rent stabilized housing where the rent's not going to jump up and you're going to be in the same position again, unable to pay rent. So there are standards for these, and in some cases people are required to pay the money back over time, but we are seeing the rate of rejections just skyrocketing.
WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand, thanks for your reporting always on all these things that you've talked about today. In this case, David, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Brian.